So here we are at Fort Ross State Historic Park, the old Russian fur trading fort. This is the only fort in the lower 49 U.S. states that belong to the Russians. These lands out here used to be where the livestock and the farms were kept, also some of the 50 buildings that were outside of the enclosure.
Fort Ross officially opened as a state park in 1906. The fort has been around since 1812. Construction on the fort, however, was not completed until exactly 200 years ago in 1814.
The timber in the woods of Fort Ross were used for a few shipbuilding excursions. However, the poor quality of the timber made it hard for them to actually build quality ships.
The Kahl family residence is an original building, but it was built after the Russians left the fort. The Kahl family were the last people to own the fort before it was handed over to the state.
This side is where the Russian village was placed, where the actual people who worked on the fort would live.
The cemetery is one of, if not the most important area in the fort because it provided researchers with clear evidence of who lived at the fort. The number of women in the cemetery shows that the fort was a mercantile settlement.
Here we are at the actual enclosure of the fort. The enclosure consisted of 9 buildings when the Russians owned it.
Unfortunately, Fort Ross is being worked on right now in order to expand the site. The buildings are closed on Tuesdays, and since today is a Tuesday, I cannot film inside the buildings. Nonetheless, the outside of the buildings still provide a good picture of what life was like at the fort. The enclosure originally had 9 buildings, but only 6 have been reconstructed. The reason for this is these were the only buildings with detailed descriptions of what they looked like and exactly where they were. This is the Kuskov House, named after the first manager of the fort. It served as Kuskov's office and a storeroom for weapons and valuables. The building was either destroyed or taken apart before 1906. The fort did contain weapons such as these cannons. While their primary mission was fur trapping, the fort still needed to be protected. The Spanish were settled close to the fort and threatened to encroach on the Russian territory at any time. This is the warehouse. Fur, livestock, and agricultural goods were kept here. The barrels lining the front are reproductions of the ones made at the fort used to hold pitch. This building, called the Rochaev House, or the Commander's House, is the only original structure left at the fort that was built in 1812 by the Russians. This is the officials' quarters. It was one of the first buildings constructed and stood standing until 1916 when it was demolished to rebuild the chapel. This is not the original well, but this is the exact location of the original. When the fort was taken apart, the well was not filled in, leaving the hole the Russians had dug. The chapel was built in 1825, one of the last buildings to be built in the fort. The Russian settlers paid for it with their own money. It is also one of the few buildings that survived after John Sutter took the fort apart for supplies. It was destroyed in 1906 during an earthquake, so it is not the original building. We are lucky enough to be allowed inside even though the buildings are closed today.
The fort was placed near the water because the main purpose of the fort was fur trapping. The beaches at Fort Ross were originally settled by the Russians because of their abundance in sea otters. However, within a few years of the fort opening, sea otters were down to very few numbers, and the fort was forced to close eventually because of the lack of sea otters.
After the Russians left, the fort changed hands many times but was never again used as a fort. Most owners just took what was left of wood and supplies. Therefore, the importance of Fort Ross rests entirely in the Russian settlement.